Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Malu Dumim in Israel. There is something to be said for common sense. For starters, there is the most common observation that it isn't very common. We all have it stored away somewhere, but it only surfaces at opportune moments. Somehow, the rest of the time, we are stuck in some sort of fog of craziness that seems to take over our otherwise rational minds. Another thing about common sense is that it doesn't really exist in any catalog or text. It just somehow is, even though we cannot prove it or search for it in some online library. A third thing is that you cannot pay any amount of money or time to gain common sense. Either you have it or you don't. There are no courses to take and no books to read. It is picked up by living life patiently and sensibly. It is difficult to know if common sense is located somewhere in the brain. It doesn't seem like the type of thing to be stored between a bunch of neurons. If anything, it is contained in the collective wisdom of the human race, wherever that might be. But it doesn't really need other people. It is probably true that somebody who spends their life on a desert island with nobody else around would have just as much common sense, if not more, than one of the masses. So, where does it come from and where is it stored? It seems to be a learned pattern of thought, like knowing how to count or greeting people with a smile. A good deal of it is learned from parents or siblings or friends, but much of it comes from that old college of hard knocks. It is stored in the memory, but it is also out there in the world. Sometimes we pick it up by watching others not displaying it. Probably the most effective method of gaining it is watching ourselves fall flat on our faces because we didn't have a little of this most uncommon of common knowledge. It is hard to imagine a time in which common sense wasn't available for anybody who wished to find it. What would people do without it? How would they survive even a single day? Perhaps it is a form of human instinct, paralleling the ability of an animal to know where to find food or a bird knowing how to fly. It is the human version of a spider's skill in spinning a web. The real question about common sense is not where it came from or how long it has been around, but why is it that we frequently don't have it? We find ourselves doing the most idiotic things, knowing full well that a little sprinkle of common sense would straighten everything out. So, why don't we have it all the time, or at least when we most need it? There is no answer to this question, but that shouldn't stop us from wondering about it. Why isn't common sense more common? It is so obvious when it is used and so glaringly missing when it isn't. Perhaps it is something that we have to constantly be on the lookout for, and it slips under the radar if we aren't. When it pops up at some opportune moment, we should be filled with gratitude to whatever deity sprung it into our mind, or at least didn't prevent us from discovering it on our own. On the other hand, maybe God has nothing to do with it. Maybe this is the human mind figuring things out without any divine assistance or prophetic insight. The Bible has its share of common sense, if one knows where to look. Moshe had the sense to turn and look at that burning bush instead of just walking away. Solomon had the wisdom to settle that famous dispute about who was the real mother of the baby by suggesting that they cut it in half and give each woman her share. But there is a balance throughout. For each case of common sense, there are several examples in which it seems rarer than rubies. It wasn't so common in biblical times either. This week's Parsha is called Yitro. Yitro was a person, making him one of the select few who have a Parsha named after them. He was the father-in-law of Moshe, and he reappears after a long absence to introduce the first section of the Parsha. He comes up three times in the Torah, towards the beginning of Exodus, when Moshe runs away from Pharaoh and finds both refuge and a wife with Yitro in the land of Midian, here, and later on when he resurfaces as the Israelites are leaving the Sinai area. But it is here that we gain our greatest impression of who he was. The other times he is a side player in the big picture, but here he stands front and center, almost the equal of Moshe. The Parsha begins with Yitro hearing about all that God did for the Israelites during the Exodus. He shows up with Moshe's wife, Tzipporah, and her two children, the sons of Moshe. He is greeted with great acclaim and filled in on all the details of the Exodus. His reaction is to recognize that no deity could possibly compare to Hashem, and seems ready to join the Israelites on their journey to the Promised Land. He then observes Moshe dealing with the daily problems of the Israelites from morning to evening. He asks Moshe why this is the way things are, and Moshe replies that this is what the people need. Yitro then tells his son-in-law that this cannot continue. Both Moshe and the people will get worn out by the impracticality of this arrangement. He then suggests that Moshe create all kinds of positions to serve as intermediaries in handling the daily affairs of the people. These underlings can deal with the easy stuff, and only the really hard things need to come to Moshe's attention. With this arrangement, Yitro assures Moshe the Israelites will reach their destination in a state of peace. Moshe takes Yitro's advice and appoints people to fill these secondary roles. Right after this, we are told, Moshe sends Yitro off and he returns to his land. The rest of the Parsha is nothing less than the prelude and the actual event of the giving of the Ten Commandments. The preparations for this momentous event take a few days, with the general purification of all the people and a harsh series of warnings to not approach anywhere near Mount Sinai when things reach a crescendo. These warnings have to be repeated a few times, apparently because there would be great temptation to get a better look at what was happening. This was not just any event. It was not even just any biblical event. It was the Ten Commandments, probably the most influential code of law ever presented. They begin with the famous, I am Hashem your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt from the institution of slavery. They end with the last commandment about coveting that which belongs to your neighbor. In between is the most fundamental moral and ethical code ever devised. It has it all, even if countless details had to be filled in and each society had to fit things into their particular situation. There is no overestimating the significance of the Ten Commandments. The fact that they were given directly by God to the Israelites only magnifies their importance. They stand alone as the primary message of the Bible and the basis for all civilization. Let's get back to Yitro and that bit of advice that he gave Moshe. His words of warning to Moshe were, quote, what you are doing is not good. You are going to wear yourself out along with this nation that is with you. Your responsibility is too great. You cannot do it alone. He then tells Moshe to appoint those subordinates to handle the administration of justice on a daily level. Quote, they will then share the burden, making things easier for you. If you agree to this and God commands you, you will succeed, and all of this people will arrive at their destination in peace. It sounds like good old common sense. Moshe was micromanaging things, trying to handle everything by himself. It was the classic idea of division of labor. It seems very simple and straightforward. The only really strange thing about all of this is why didn't anybody think of this earlier? Why didn't one of those people Moshe appointed to handle the easy stuff come up with this idea? Why didn't Moshe himself realize that the arrangement they had up to that point would not work? Why didn't God tell Moshe this suggestion? It's not as if Moshe was oblivious to God throughout this whole time. On the contrary, he was communicating with God on what seems to have been a daily basis. It's also not as if God didn't have a constant means of communication with Moshe. That line appears to have always been open. Anything God needed to tell Moshe, whether concerning the setup of the Ten Commandments or how to deal with things like the splitting of the sea or a dire lack of water in the desert, would always find a ready and willing ear. This was the epitome of prophetic communication. Anything that needed saying was said and understood. All the problems, from the minor ones to the earth shakers, were divinely resolved. So what about this problem? Why wasn't this one of the many things that God told Moshe? Would it have been so difficult for God to tell Moshe that he should appoint subordinates to take some of the burden off his shoulders? There doesn't seem to be any answers to any of these questions. In fact, nobody asks them. This was the situation that Yitro walked in on, and he alone was able to see the problem and to solve it with the tiniest bit of common sense. He was able to figure out what Moshe, with all of his prophetic abilities and leadership skills, was unable to even recognize as a problem. This is a bit mind-boggling. How could this be? The answer, as we could all figure out with a little common sense, is that people cannot see beyond the ends of their noses. Even if they are immersed in divine communication, like Moshe was prior to the events at Mount Sinai, they may be oblivious to the most obvious things. This was not something that God could tell Moshe. If he couldn't figure it out for himself, he would have to learn the hard way to realize that things were bound to fail at some point. This is the only way to learn common sense. All the prophecy in the world won't cover for a lack of common sense. This is a fascinating observation. The highest form of knowledge, whether prophetic, scientific, or philosophical, doesn't amount to a hill of beans if common sense isn't there to fill in the gaps. Yitro, who was no prophet, pointed something out that Moshe couldn't see, even with his connection to God. He was an outsider, and sometimes it takes an outsider to recognize a problem that the insiders cannot see. Perhaps this is why Moshe sent him away. It is not easy to realize that somebody else sees what is staring us right in the face. Common sense is a threat to those who lack it. Shabbat Shalom.